So good morning, everybody. Nice to see so many participants in the room. I'm sure also online there will be some participation. We have a hybrid event today. My name is Dennis Tenzler. I'm head of climate policy at Adelphi. Adelphi is part of the Habitable consortium who is supporting this side event today. And I have the pleasure to I have a couple of colleagues here supporting me in our overall discussion today on beyond models, human mobility, and social impacts of climate change. That is online with us, Francois Gemenne, the director of the Uyghur Observatory, and with the University of Liège. We have Harald Sterli, senior scientist on environmental migration data at the University of Vienna with us. We have can welcome Mechthild Becker from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, and also with us is Alice Baillat from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, working as a policy coordinator there, and Manuel Marquis Pereira from IOM joins us here on the panel. And we have the pleasure online also to welcome Kirine Joel Markitalu. She is with the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, and also a pioneer in data for climate mobility with the project, and she will also share some experiences. And we would like to structure our side event today that we give first a few input statements to set the stage on what we think is an important discussion to consider the right framing of human mobility, and to reflect on existing research on migration decisions, which are also influenced from our perspective on the social perception of local populations, and also when it comes to the adaptation policy responses that needs to be taken. So that with the input statement, then we will move over to a hopefully interactive Q&A session with you in the second part. So with I would like to open the floor for Francois Gemenne from Uyghur Observatory, the lead of the Habitable Research Project. He's online. And hello, Francois. The floor is yours.
Hello, Dennis. And hello, everyone. And thanks a lot for having me on stage, although virtually. I will not take long because I don't want to preempt too much on the panel discussion. But I just wanted to say a few words to set the stage and introduce the Habitable project and why I think the Habitable project can make a difference when it comes to adaptation decisions, and in particular with regard to migration as part of the migration decisions. We all understand that habitability today is one of the key stakes, if not the key stake, around climate change. The problem that we have is that we are often framed in a deterministic perspective where we assume that the magnitude of migration flows related to climate impacts will be directly dependent on the magnitude of these impacts themselves. Yet, we know very well, and I think this is one of the key perks of the concept of social tipping point, which was introduced in the latest report by the IPCC, we know very well that the social transformations in a society are not directly dependent on the magnitude of climate impacts. To put things differently, we know that a highly resilient society can absorb some climate shocks, including major climate shocks, whereas on the other hand, some minor climate shocks can induce major social transformation in a society that is not resilient. And it all depends on the level of resilience of the society and therefore on the threshold of the social tipping point. And therefore, for this project, Habitable, what was really important for us was to recognize the social dimension of habitability and to break away from the model-based physical determination of habitability. And therefore, in this project, we focus on the household level rather than on the big numbers. The goal of the project is really not to say how many people will be displaced in the future as a result of climate impacts, but is really to understand what is driving the migration decision process at the local level, at the individual level. And for this, the project highlights the role of the subjective perceptions of climate impacts, but also of the risks and opportunities. It is essential that we remember that the perceptions of climate impacts do not always match the actual observations of these impacts. And yet, the decisions are shaped by perceptions much more than they are by the actual observations. Because sometimes local populations simply don't have access to climate information, but also sometimes because their perceptions differ from the actual observation. And we need to recognize that the decision is, of course, based on the perception rather than on the observations. And I think this is one of the key innovations that is brought upon by the Habitable project. And therefore, the project very much insists on the non-linearity of the social changes that are associated with these climate impacts. We do recognize that once a threshold is reached, then social transformation will be induced, but this is a non-linear process. And what is essential for us is to understand when and how this threshold is reached. And for this, we develop a series of methods based on an approach that is really revolving around the systems. Unlike other projects that were very much also empirical projects, we do not consider that there is on the one hand the origin area and on the other the destination area, but that both are part of a migration system that is also a socio-ecological system. So this systemic dimension is essential in the project. We also combine, I would say, qualitative data with quantitative data with a view to connecting the actual current evidence with the future projections. And therefore, we reckon that the project should ideally prove essential for the design and implementation of adaptation options that recognize the role of migration, but that recognize how the decision-making is being made on the local individual level. And I think this is really what the project can bring to the table of those negotiations in Bonn and further to break away from the deterministic determinations of the social impacts associated with climate impacts, and in particular, of course, of migration. Just to conclude, a few technical words about the project, which is a 4-year project funded by the European Commission. The project associates 21 international partners that come from Europe, but also from Africa and Asia. And we focus very much on a string of countries in Africa, which are Mali, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, Senegal, and South Africa, with one case study in Thailand as well. So we are now gathering the very first results of the project, and these results will be introduced by my colleagues in a moment. We will also come in these different countries in the coming months for stakeholder engagement activities. So if you come from these countries, I urge you to reach to some of my colleagues to see how we can set up collaborations on the field, and the project will conclude at the end of next year. Final point that I want to raise, if there are some members of the research community in the room, all the data that are collected through the project, including data from quantitative surveys, will be made available online and for free on the website of the project. So hopefully this production of new data can also serve not just the policy community, but also the academic community. And on this note, I will stop here and yield the floor to my colleagues who will present the results. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for highlighting the main elements of the project, Francois, and also the importance of the local level and where the ongoing work now tries to provide some impact, be it during the field missions and the stakeholder engagement, be it also through the scenario work. Please stay tuned. We hope that we have further chance to engage in the discussion. With respect to these first insights of the Habitable project, this concept also, I would like now to give the floor to Harald Sterli from the University of Vienna with his presentation on towards more equitable adaptation, intersectional approach to climate impacts, habitability, and migration. So, Harald, I'm happy to also then go further to support you here, but the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have the presentation somewhere? Ah, perfect.
There we go.
Yeah, great. Yes, towards more equitable adaptation. That's the direction I want to guide us a bit. And in my contribution, I want to highlight two aspects that are in our view in the first discussions that we had upon the first data coming in. Now it's not hard results yet, it's first intermediate things, I would say. Two aspects that are important. That's a strongly intersectional perspective on the differences of resilience and habitability that is necessary, and an inclusion of the connectivity of people and places to come to a, well, action-oriented knowledge on habitability. Well, the first, habitability is not affecting, or changes in habitability, losses of habitability are not affecting all the people in the same way and to the same degree. Habitability is rather unequally distributed along multiple intersecting axes of differences, such as gender, age, ethnicity, etc. Why does that matter, and why is that so? On the one hand, changes in habitability, in the ability of a place to sustain people's livelihoods in the broadest way we can talk about that, does not affect all people in a place in the same way, but rather depends on the ways how people interact with the given specificities of a social ecological system or a place. A dryland savanna, for example, might be perfectly habitable for pastoralists, while it might be literally uninhabitable for farmers or rice farmers, for example, with a totally different need for social ecological services. And on the other hand, changes in habitability do not affect all people to the same degree. Rather, this depends a lot on the social status and the position of individuals and groups within local society. For example, a given place might be habitable for people that are well off, while poorer people might perceive it as much less habitable, for example, when internal or local redistribution systems fail due to increasing resource depletion, or when certain social groups are excluded from resource use to scarcity. Next slide, please. Second, places never exist and probably never have existed in isolation. Therefore, it is necessary to think these places or these social ecological systems not as bounded and as closed off systems, but as connected and in exchange and considering their relations to the outside. Places are connected with other places at least through three different ways: through biophysical systems and exchanges and flows, through material and immaterial structures, transportation infrastructure, that's a basic example, and of course through flows of resources, people, and information. Examples for this are all sorts of water, nutrient, or biological cycles, but also transport, communication, infrastructure, symbolic, political, or administrative relations, and last but not least, financial goods transfers, interactions, or migration. all of these do influence and shape the habitability of any given place. If we consider the important role of agricultural subsidies and policy measures in the European Union, for example, that are meant to sustain livability in depopulating rural areas, or the importance of food aid to prevent further drought displacement in the Horn of Africa, or the more than 630 billion US dollars of remittances sent by international migrants last year, that becomes evident. Governments and private corporations are especially important actors for increasing, maintaining, but also for decreasing the habitability of certain places from the outside. When funding and supporting irrigation infrastructure in desert areas, creating and sustaining military towns in high mountain areas, or mining places in the Arctic or in deserts, these actors create or sustain the habitability of otherwise non-habitable places. They do this for asserting, for example, territorial control, securing boundaries, or accessing resources. They can also seek to maintain these kinds of infrastructure in places, thereby decreasing local habitability. And they have the power to define structural, for example, market or policy frameworks that set the stage for exchange and interactions across places. Connectivity can thus increase habitability, but also decrease it, or both can happen in different dimensions, or first one and then the other. And connectivity can, in addition to stabilizing social ecological systems, also increase their vulnerability if places or people or systems are very dependent on connectivities. So what does that mean for migration and adaptation? As experienced and perceived habitability is differentiated along very fine-grained intersecting lines of differences, so are the aspirations, the needs, and the capabilities for migration and mobilities. As Francois pointed out, migration decisions are taken on household and individual levels largely. How and for whom climate change translates thus into mobilities depends very much on the specific context. This requires, of course, bottom-up perspectives and socially inclusive and equitable approaches to come up with effective adaptation solutions exactly for those who are most in need. And the connected nature of habitability reminds us to see migration not only as part of a problem, what it can also be for, of course, when it occurs especially without choice and under unfavorable and unfair conditions, but it can also be part of solutions when it contributes to adaptation and vulnerability reduction. One important goal of the project is to disentangle the conditions and the context when the one or the other happens. But connectivity and this idea of thinking places as connected also raises fundamental questions about the role, necessity, or legitimacy of external support for vulnerable places and people when partial loss or damage appears or habitability changes, and hence also for climate justice. While we usually do not question the gigantic transfers of agricultural subsidies in the European Union, for example, and the permanent transfer, the idea of a at least functional and financially appropriate loss and damage fund, or even a system for more permanent support of vulnerable places and people that become less habitable, seems to be in wide distance. So with these messages that we can at least partially derive on data, and we will fill this up with more evidence in the near future, I would like to conclude and bring this out to hopefully the debates and discussions in this event.
Yeah, thank you, Harald. And I think there is already quite some food for thought that we can bring in then later on into the discussion. Migration as an adaptation solution, what does this mean for the overall design of adaptation policies? What kind of experience are there here on the research side, but more broadly also on your side, also on the ground, that we need to reflect when designing those dedicated policies as only one element, but I think also the overall role of the context and how important this entanglement, as Harald mentioned, will be for further activities. So that was already one reflection, or the second reflection on the Habitable project. With Mechthild Becker now, we move on, I would say. We move not only to the Habitable, or we move beyond Habitable, because Mechthild has been involved quite intensively in the BAPIC project at the Potsdam Institute, or the consortium led by the Potsdam Institute, and she will now share her experience connecting climate capacities with country realities, insights from, as I said, the BAPIC project and Habitable, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. I'll just wait till the presentation is set up. A very warm welcome to my input. And as Dennis just mentioned, I'm actually wearing two hats today. So I'm representing, I could borrow your hat, but one wouldn't be enough for me today. So I'm representing Work Package 4 of the Habitable project on behalf of my wonderful colleagues Julia Blocher and Diogo Seraglio. And the project I'm working in, BAPIC, and this acronym stands for Brazil, East Africa, Peru, India Climate Capacities. So BAPIC is part of the International Climate Initiative of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and implemented by the Federal Foreign Office. Both Habitable and BAPIC are located at PIC, as already mentioned, and we collaborate closely on our qualitative migration work. Last month, for example, we conducted a workshop together, a whole day on migration in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and I'm looking forward to welcome the Habitable colleagues at PIC next month and meet my new Ethiopian friends. Next slide, please. Okay, so maybe jump right into the meta. Next slide. So please bear in mind, I'm presenting this on behalf of colleagues. So research questions in Work Package 4 of Habitable include how climate impacts affect the decision to adapt or to not adapt. And there's also a focus on understanding gender dimensions in migration decisions. The aim of the work package is to gain qualitative insights into adaptation solutions, and for this, the team investigates individual, household, and community-level strategies, and at the end, they will be collected in an inventory of examples of local-level response strategies. And these inventory will also include assessments of policies and programs, so their strengths and weaknesses. And to explore the linkages between strategies to adapt and migration dynamics, a lot of semi-structured interviews have already been conducted in all primary sites of the Habitable project. And next slide. And these interviews were guided by the PIC and conducted by country teams. So for this purpose, a handbook for qualitative interviews on the climate migration nexus has been developed. And it offers guidance on the interview approach or discusses issues like data protection. If you're German or if you have been working with German, you know how important data protection is in such projects. So this is a handbook. It's, as far as I know, to be revised and also made available at a later stage, guiding students, master students, and practitioners. So country trainings have been carried out already. And since the beginning of the year, my colleague Diogo is very busy analyzing the primary data, so he has long office days. As already mentioned, decisions are taken at the migration decisions are taken at the household level, and I really think that the findings of the Habitable project and particularly of this work package will really broaden the knowledge base and can make a difference for informed decision makings. But I think we have to be a bit more patient till the first results are public. But yes, I can already tell you it's something to look forward to. Next slide, please. So finally to my project, which is the project with a very long name, Brazil, East Africa, Peru, India Climate Capacities Project. So climate capacities stands for our approach that we really try to go to countries, make informed decisions, trying to understand what are the needs, and then work on them. So as you can see on the left, Be Epic truly is an interdisciplinary project. We investigate climate impacts on agriculture and water resources and how this in turn may or may not affect migration dynamics. The project's partner countries are Brazil, Peru, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and India. Brazil and Ethiopia have only become partner countries last year. But for the partner countries that have been there from the very beginning, which is 2018, we have published migration reports. And I think these migration reports really best evidence how beneficial it is to have researchers from diverse backgrounds in one project from several disciplines. So these 3 major risk assessments reports on climate change and migration, as you can see here, 2 have been published together with IOM in the Assessing the Evidence series, which I assume some of you are familiar with. There will be one on Ethiopia, hopefully by the end of the year, and this will also be published together with IOM. We have also published a report on India, and in the case of India, I mean, India is a very large country. We have focused on one state, and this is the state of Uttarakhand, and the report is published together with our partner, the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. So a little bit of on the background of Uttarakhand. The Uttarakhand report, like all the other reports, try to understand the multi-layered nature of livelihood risks for people in primarily agrarian settings. And of course, how this links to migration decisions and migration realities. And what you see here is an example of how we have tried to map climate-related livelihood risks and migration dynamics in these reports, here at the example of Uttarakhand. And I cannot go into detail here, but for me, this Indian state is a prime example of why qualitative research really is so crucial to understand livelihood risks and how migration decisions are shaped by so many contextual factors, including risk perceptions. Because one back still? Can you go back again? Sorry. So because in this fragile hill ecosystem at the foothills of the Himalaya, climate change is creating additional livelihood risks. So it's already a very fragile environment to live in, and climate impacts like changing rain patterns really change the characteristics of mountain life and also the unique heritage and culture of hill communities, because a lot of people are forced to out-migrate from the hills to the lower plains. So this is really where you can see social impacts of climate change. Next slide. So this already is my last slide. I thought it would be nice to share that Be Epic also has the capacity to host guests. And I remember one guest very, very much, and because he was the last before the pandemic hit, and it really showed how it makes a difference to meet in person and also to learn from each other in person. So you see here a workshop, and we welcomed Emmanuel Ole Kileli Leani from Ethiopia, and Emma, as we call him, is a Maasai and very active in community development and youth action. And he was with us at PIC for 2 months, and he applied his expertise to review and validate the results of our migration research on mobile farmers and pastoralists in Tanzania, and also co-authored the migration report and other journals. And I think for him this was a learning experience, but for us also, because Emma really said, very nice written, but it's different for us. Or you have to write it in a way that we understand what you mean. So, and then I remember this this workshop here on participatory scenario planning, and we really learned at PIC, so which is famous for its modeling capacities in natural sciences. We had this Maasai here, a youth activist, telling us how we need to get better in communicating our results in order that they make a difference. So we really learned about lived realities in Maasai communities in a changing climate, and how the Maasai perceive climate change. And I learned a lot about the value of indigenous knowledge and practices for adaptation. And what we learned is how to build community-based adaptation plans for farmers and livestock keepers, and also really to make them more accessible. So, I mean, we really have to demystify climate information, because at the end of the day, we want to make an impact on the ground. And I think, I'm not sure if there are funders in the room, but exchanges like this are so valuable to really learn, and learning is not a one-way street. So I think we learned more from Emma than he did from us, but of course it was also okay to give him this chance and be with us at PIC. And I think with that, this is it from my side already. Thank you very much. Vielen Dank.
Mechtil, many thanks, and I think funders in the room will have the chance to identify themselves later on in order to support further activities in this based on the participatory scenario planning approach. We will also have further scenarios in this way as part of the Habitable project. You referred to the demystification of climate information, and probably that is now our chance to go to the 3 remaining inputs that are not directly linked to the Habitable project. We will start with Alice Baillat, Policy Coordinator. She will, at the internal displacement migration center, and will outline some of the key insights from your data, but what your colleagues are basically exploring. And either you come over or I will again help with the presentation.
No, thank you, Denis, and I'm happy if you projectize the presentation, and I will tell you when to change slides.
And of course, it's a monitoring, not the migration center.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Denis. And actually, perhaps I'm going to start with a few words on what the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center is, because I'm not sure everyone in this room is familiar with our work, so perhaps it's a good start. So IDMC is a center of expertise. We are based in Geneva. We exist for 25 years now, and we have been created within the Norwegian Refugee Council. And what we do for the last 25 years is that we monitor and we analyze data on internal displacement. So we started with displacement related to conflict and violence, but since 2008, so for 15 years now, we also monitor displacement in the context of disasters. And we only monitor internal displacement, so we do not look at cross-border movements, but as we know, disasters and climate change, as it is stated in the IPCC reports, and in most of the literature, like the vast majority of movements that we can expect and that are already occurring in the context of climate change are mainly internal. And so beyond assessing the scale of displacement due to disasters, we also produced a lot of research on so not only the scale, but also the patterns, the dynamics, and the socioeconomic impact of displacement. So, I mean, I just strongly invite you also to look at our website if you want to also see more specifically how disaster displacement impact, for instance, access to education, access to health, and affect different groups, women, children, people with disabilities, and so on. Next slides, please. Yes, and so we annually publish our data in a flagship report that we call the GRID. So the GRID is a global report on internal displacement. And actually, we released our last report less than a month ago. So I'm going to briefly introduce the latest figures that we have reported for disasters displacement last year. And unfortunately, I mean, last year was a record year in terms of disaster displacements because we reported more than 32 million internal displacements due to disasters worldwide. And among these movements, 98% were due to weather-related hazards, so mainly floods and storms, which we know are influenced by climate change and might increase both in intensity and frequency. because of rising temperatures or rainfall patterns changing. And this big number of disaster displacement last year was mainly due to a prolonged La Nina phenomenon, which triggered disasters in different parts of the world. And among these 32 million, it's quite striking to note that 25% of them were reported only in Pakistan following the monsoon flooding. So over the 32 million, more than 8 million were only in Pakistan because of floodings. And also more than 2 million movements were reported in the Horn of Africa, so mainly Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, because of a drought that is the most severe one recorded in the region for the last 40 years now. But beyond these large-scale events, I think it's also important to note that a majority and many of these displacements are also the result of small-scale events that are usually underreported and under-researched. But these small-scale events also triggered, even if it's only 10, 15, or a couple of hundreds of displacements accumulated, and when they are repeated, they can have serious impacts on the habitability of the territories and on people's vulnerabilities and coping capacity to deal with those hazards. And as you can see, there is also a few countries that are specifically more affected by this number of displacements. So Pakistan last year was the main one, but Philippines, China, India, and Nigeria also recorded a lot of those displacements. Next slide, please. Yes. Yeah, no, you can, yeah. No, next one, because I already mentioned this one, actually. Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, it's interesting to look at the number last year, which, again, was the highest number ever reported by IDMC in terms of disaster displacement. But it's also interesting to look at the trend. And if you look at the number of disaster displacement recorded over the last decades, I mean, what you can see is that, of course, there are some variation from one year to another, but in average, the trend of disaster displacement is on the rise. And for the last 10 years, it's more than 233 million displacement due to disasters that were recorded worldwide. Meaning new displacement, because every year what we do is that we only record like the new displacement, so from 1st of January to 31st of December. And the number is quite striking. Next slides, please. And of course, not to say that disaster displacement, this level of displacement is much greater than the number of displacement that we report for conflict and violence over the same period. And if it's important to note that disaster displacement is a global phenomenon, it's also important to say that there are some regions that are more affected than others by this phenomenon. So last year was particularly South Asia, because of the flooding in Pakistan, was particularly affected. But in general, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa are the region most concerned by this displacement. But I think it's also important to note that it's a worldwide phenomenon, and more we also record increasing level of disaster displacement in the Americas, in Europe, because of wildfire, heat waves, and so on. So it's really a phenomenon that affects every region. Next slides, please. So what I presented now is a number of displacement. At IDMC, we actually have two main metrics to assess this phenomenon. So the first one is the one I just presented. So it's a number of movements, but it's important to note that the number of movements do not equal people, because the same person can be displaced several times per year if she or he is affected by multiple disasters. And no, previous slides. Yes, thank you. So we also have another metric that is the number of IDPs reported at the end of the year because of disasters. And for last year, I mean, we reported almost 9 million IDPs due to disasters across the world. and mainly in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and a few other places. But just to say that this number is high, but is also highly conservative. So in reality, we do not know exactly how many persons are displaced at the end of the year. First, because from IDMC, I mean, we can only report data on IDPs, and we monitor IDPs due to disasters only since 2017. So, I mean, we don't have a lot of historical data to report this phenomenon. But also because there is a lot of data gaps, especially, for instance, to assess the duration of displacements. I mean, usually we can, we know, thanks to humanitarian actors, assessing and collecting data on the ground immediately following a disaster, how many persons are displaced. But usually these assessments stop after a couple of weeks. And so it's really hard to know what these people become a couple of weeks after the disasters, and to know exactly how long they are displaced and what are their needs, and so on. So these data, I mean, as you understand, are mainly based on past and present figures. And these figures are informative to inform protection and assistance measures to address the current situation of disaster displacement. But in reality, they are very insufficient to reduce also the future displacement risk and to be prepared for future movements. And we know, and the last IPCC report has been very clear on that there is now a high level of confidence that climate change combined with other factors will likely increase future movements. So we need to be prepared for this, and we need to better assess the risk of this future displacement. And so this is actually what we're trying to do as IDMC and as part of the Habitable project. Next slides, please. Because we already have a disaster displacement risk model, but as it is now, this model doesn't include climate change scenario. And to assess the vulnerability of people, for now, our model was only looking at the physical vulnerability, so meaning the probability of being displaced because your house has been destroyed or damaged. But it was the way we were looking at the vulnerability, and as it has been said by my colleagues previously, I mean, to assess people's vulnerability to climate change, and the decision or the ability to move or not to move is not only due to the physical vulnerability, but other factors that influence the economic and social vulnerability of this person. So what we're trying to do in this model is to fine-tune the different components through which we look at displacement risk. And so for the hazards, we will, as part of Habitable, we are working on now including climate change scenarios, so the RCP scenarios, so that we will better assess to what extent some hazards, according to a pessimist or more optimist scenario, will have an increased likelihood of triggering displacement or not. For the exposure, we will also have a more granular model resolution, so to better see exactly people and assets that are exposed to an hazard. And for the vulnerability, we will include these socioeconomic pathways that the IPCC is also using now. And so, just because to conclude, because I think I'm already speaking for too long. But why this model are useful, even if, and I think as the title of this slide even said, I mean, it's important to go beyond models, but still this model are useful to generate more accurate assessments, actually, of the risk of displacement. It's important to be able to prepare for and respond to this displacement. It's also important to prevent future displacement. But this, I mean, it's true that it's important to go beyond model that can only quantify the occurrence of displacement. And I think it's what our model was doing until now. It's quantifying the occurrence of a displacement, and what we're going to do in the future, thanks to the Habitable project and the work we're doing, it's to also better estimate the future risk of displacement, but also its impact and how it can affect a different group, their needs and their vulnerability and so on. So it's more like integrating this socio-economic aspect of vulnerability into a model to go beyond just only the occurrence of displacement. And I will stop here so that, but I'm happy to answer your question after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice, and especially also for your critical reflection on the overall reliability and usability as the data is right now, and what there needs to be added actually also to further inform policy measures. And I'm really sure that we get back to this question later on. So with respect to the how risk information and perception influence mobility as adaptation and the debate on loss and damage, we will now turn to Manuel Marquez Pereira from IOM. Manuel is head at the headquarters for the division on migration, environment, climate and risk reduction. So happy to give you the floor for your insights, and I will.
Thank you, and good morning to you all. When I was asked to talk, and please, if we could stay there on the cover, there was a conversation about what are perceptions. I will give you a few examples from practice on how people perceive risk and how that perception of risk, not having information on climate change, makes people, the decisions of people are conditioned by that. This picture is in the Philippines. After Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2015, and as you may guess, those two boats there on the corner should not be on land on the top of the fishing community that live there. And thus, my point today is that for IOM, people should be safe, empowered, and informed to make decisions about their own mobility. And no one should be displaced. And from here, we build our approach to this thematic in a lot of work in relation to what mobility is and the right to choose about mobility. Next, please. This is how people in many other places in coastal areas, this is actually in the Philippines, live with risk. People live close to their livelihoods. People live close to places that allow mobility, roads, different areas that are viable. This is a fishing community that had 200 meters for the sea, and this is a boat that was in the harbor that a surge storm brought 2 kilometers inland on the top of the community. But at the same time, we have other areas, and especially coastal areas, where people live right on the sea. So as you may understand, these communities live and depend on their livelihood. So a lot of their mobility choices are tied in by their livelihoods. And people will make sacrifices and they will make compromises about of their security based on how they perceive the risk to where they are exposed and how their livelihoods fulfills their basic needs. These communities in the Philippines refuse to relocate to other communities with very valid reasons, because due to the cost of land, options of moving somewhere are options out of the fisherman access, let's say, or the abandonment of boats overnight or paying a security guard. So there's a lot of considerations that make people immobile. Next. No, that's the last, that's the second, yeah. So this is Bangladesh. On the top, the bottom part of Bangladesh, on a very narrow peninsula, there is 1 million Rohingya refugees that live in 24 square kilometers in mud and plastic hut houses. This camp was made on a natural park after the vegetation was cut. All of these constructions are very flimsy and temporary. But Bangladesh is a country that has an extreme precipitation over the year that is very, well, it's on the Bay of Bengal and is exposed to significant amount of very intense wind events. And there is also a very strong lack of awareness of what risk means, especially for these people. And I make the case of Bangladesh, but I could be talking about any community that is on a humanitarian setting, because the humanitarian settings are one of the forefronts of climate that we are not necessarily looking into. These communities are extremely exposed, extremely vulnerable, and they have very little coping or adaptive capacities. Next. And this is Pakistan in 2010, which has the same issues of house, land, and property associated with livelihoods, where people have to stay in a certain place to guarantee that they have a contract to work on a piece of land. That contract many times is associated with some form of bond labor, so people increase that, and mounting that stop them from moving, and all decisions on mobility, getting out of harm's way, like we saw the floods last year, is conditioned to returning, or returning to secure their livelihood, or to run away so that they don't pay the debt to the landlord. And these are the questions and the perceptions that many times influence how people then make a decision to stay or to move. Can we move? Next slide, sorry. But there are ways, and about the ways I want to talk to you about perceptions, right? That house that you saw in the bush picture before in Pakistan, that's when people received assistance on reconstruction after the initial emergency assistance. So 1 year after the floods, they were living in that bush house with the leftovers of the tent that they received from the humanitarians. 18 months after that period, they were living on the house below. And this house was made by them. And here is where we start changing perceptions and understanding of risk, because working with communities around how they want to live, where they want to live, and helping them get the incremental knowledge on how to make their choices safer, in this case the house, or the practices, changing the agriculture typology of activity that people do, and in some cases helping them because they don't want to live there anymore to move, and having the adequate pathways for people to move will continue to be one of the priorities of the organization. But it's centered around the choices that people make. And if we are unable to listen to individuals and keep working with them to understand where are the gaps in knowledge, tie that with the risk that climate change offers that we already know, we will not change anything, or we will continue to invest in doing humanitarian assistance as loss and damage instead of having invested before on allowing people to adapt better and make better choices. And I will end here in a very simplified way so that our other colleagues can continue. Thank you.
Manuel, thank you very much. Also this turn at the end to also also indicate how to move to good practices and to inform policy responses with a very concrete example. Overall now, and thank you, Karine, for your patience being online. We now move our little global traveling, and we moved to Tanzania. And I introduced you at the beginning of the site event as representing one of the major groups with children and youth, but you are more than that, because you are also an entrepreneur in data collection, as I learned. And I'm excited to hear now how you bridge these two areas, or how you combine them for us in your presentation. So welcome, and again, thank you for participating here.
Thank you so much for having me today, and good morning from the rainy Dar es Salaam. As introduced, I am a co-founder of a mobile eco-hub named Notaka Tanzania, and we are powering climate action solutions along with the most vulnerable grassroots communities in Tanzania that are impacted by climate change impacts. And I am also the United Nations Global Center for Climate Mobility Fellow for the year 2023. With the hub, we are pillared in learning, innovation, and advocacy. And we believe in the power of community-led solutions. So currently, we're running a geospatial data mapping project in the northwestern part of Tanzania that is entailing using drone mapping and remote sensing technology to map out land cover features and demographic qualities for refugee camp areas in Tanzania. These are areas that are exposed to climate change impacts, but also house over 240,000 people and still taking in more due to the civil unrest situation that is ongoing in nearby countries. Principally, we're looking to inform food security interventions, but also other socioeconomic issues such as land planning and biodiversity conservation. And in the near future, in availability of funds, we're looking to expand our project and map out migration flows and trends to be able to tap into the needs of the people on the ground, help governments, development stakeholders, and other players on the ground to assist this community to adapt sustainably to the impacts of climate change, making it ready to house those that are currently there, but those that are also expected to come in the near future. And with the project, we are deeply rooted in sustainable data and its ability to transform communities that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and also the whole issue of climate-induced mobility. And first, through the project, we are able to create a synergy between stakeholders in the data and climate mobility ecosystem, as it is very critical to create relevant regulatory and legislative policies, but also financial frameworks for climate adaptation solutions that are locally led, people-centered, but also nature-based. And the integration of data by different stakeholders in adaptation efforts highlights these linkages between social issues and helps advance shared strategic goals throughout the implementation of projects, especially when it comes to creating employment opportunities, building social structures, and making available socioeconomic needs for forced displaced people, but also people on the move. And a notable example from the project is a feasibility study that we already conducted that has been used to inform the initiatives of the project on the ground. And it had an interesting data set on a third of the households that were involved in the study denoted that they could access mobile phones, and this propelled us to the interest to explore the synergy between this data set and mobile projections for socioeconomic skills building. Say, people on the move can be using mobile technology to learn different skills, or maybe develop the skills that they already have, maybe before they were forced to move or subjected to the movement. And also, with the climate crisis deepening and data projection, highlighting rapid increase in the number of people on the move due to climate impacts. And for instance, I could use a very lively example from the United Nations Global Center for Climate Mobility Africa Shifts report that highlights around over 40 million people by 2050 to be forced to move as a data projection. I think it is very timely and paramount that locally led action to contextually leverage on the sustainable power of data when developing and planning for climate adaptation strategies for us. But also, data will bring clarity to key players like decision makers or development stakeholders on specific on-the-ground issues like coping vulnerabilities that alter from one household or person to another, because case by case, it is very different. And it is very important for this data to shed a light on small faceted issues at local level. And it was very good to hear from the former speakers, having most of the researches conducted and initiatives conducted, focusing principally on local level and grassroots communities. But as well, this can help on interventions and different decisions made when it comes to adapting or empowering these people to make a safe and accessible choice to move. And a notable example from the project would be also another data that was informed through our feasibility study that showed us that around 45% of the households in the refugee camp were women-led. And this then propelled us to prioritize women leadership and include more women in, for instance, one of the activities through the project, which is soil testing centers establishment that is aiming to empower socio-economic agricultural practices for the people on the move. So we have more women join in the program and attending at the centers and helping them build capacity. And then in turn, they would go and influence or teach the households that they lead. And this henceforth brings about a ripple effect and a wider impact because of this data set. And the above example also highlights the need to recognize existing disparities of the impacts of climate change on individuals and groups. And you could see that through the data, we have a main distributary of data set that entails the women group, but then within this data set there are subgroups and that spring forth micro data sets. So for example, the impacts of climate change can impact women as a whole, but it's very different when you start unpacking these groups of women in the community to say young women are differently impacted and older women are differently impacted by climate change. And this then brings about very different responses to the need to move or to say maybe their abilities to move. It's very different. So it is very significant when we're running these initiatives and using sustainable data tools to be able to navigate these small issues that are inside the subgroups of different groups in the communities. And all this highlights the complex linkages between situational factors that shape decisions, outcomes, and risks in the whole mobility scope, and hence very important to be looked upon. Summatively, data helps us uncover and understand social issues in a very broad, informed and multifaceted approach. It allows players in the climate mobility ecosystem to conquer the right responsibilities and together with other players deliberately offer an opportunity to shape the future of mobility and our socioeconomic system sustainably under a changing climate. And I would like to end with welcoming new partnerships to join us in the movement, because we at Notaka are implementing on the ground solutions that are exploring new ways to gather and harness climate mobility data that is sustainable and induced from the local level. We invite you to join us in this work and hope that we can partner or receive any contributions to further our efforts. And thank you for this opportunity today. If you're interested in learning more about our work, I can be reached at the email that is on the presentation shared, but also you can visit our website at www.notaka.org and read more on the feasibility study and just learn more about our work. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Karen. That is really insightful with respect to the role of empowerment of data, basically. And you also, I think that was very illustrative to go to also highlight how important it is to go to the structure of the subgroup then in some of the use of the data as you outlined. And I'm pretty sure that many of the participants here will be able to access your website and to follow these kind of activities, already moving to some good practice that we can promote. I hope you stay online because we can then see right now, because now we move to our Q&A part. I would like to give now you the chance to raise your hand and please identify yourself. And if you can, at the end of your statement, also direct your question to someone here on the panel or to Karin, who is still online. This would be perfect. And I would suggest that I come with the mic to you and that we select, first of all, 3 questions and then go back to the panel. And maybe, I don't know if there's really pressure on us, but maybe we can have 2 rounds at the end, 2 rounds of question. We will see what kind of housekeeping is here. But I see already hands, 2 ones. I will come over.
Thanks. Morning, everybody. Nicole Hendrickson, Fire Circle to End All TT. I'm based in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. I don't know if anybody could answer this question, but those who can, I'll appreciate it. So one, I have one question about land grabbing and how does that impact the work that is being done. Also, too, in terms from a health perspective, I know in my country, IOM works with one of the NGOs that work on the ground in terms of sexual reproductive health, because migration is going to definitely pose a problem. In terms of my research thus far, the heat rise is going to affect pregnant women and women who are seeking to become pregnant. And that would mean that the migration issue is going to become a huge human rights issue, because women are going to make the decision to have safe pregnancies and safe deliveries in temperate countries. So just those 2 questions, and whoever wants to take it, I'll appreciate it.
My colleagues at the panel have still a little bit time to consider who is going to answer it, but I have another hand here.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the really insightful presentations. My name is Aya De Leon. I'm from the Philippines, working on legal and policy issues around climate. We've had I also work on loss and damage issues in the Philippines, and we've had interactions with some communities who have had, who are at very high risk of displacement because of sea level rise and typhoons. And one issue that we've heard from some communities who have the option to move with the assistance of either the government or through humanitarian aid is like a lack of trust with institutions, where they say, like, they promise that this will be there when we move. And I think the example that Manuel presented is really exactly very common, because there are so many vulnerable communities on the coastlines, and there's a lot of land subsidence that they have to deal with, etc. But one of the, let's say, social perceptions maybe that we hear about is they don't trust that it will be better if they actually move, or if they change their current situation. So maybe to Manuel and other panelists, what are there ways where that sort of perception can be addressed, or is it really a question of perception or maybe governance? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Mariana. I am a PhD student from Cornell University. And my question is for Alice and Mauricio from the IDCM, International Organization for Migration. It seems like you focused on the issue of sudden onset displacement, like disasters, for example, caused by flooding or earthquakes or tornadoes. But what about people who have to flee their home, or their home areas because of slow onset impacts, such as sea level rise or land desertification or land degradation? I was wondering whether there is any way to track that, because it seems like these people displaced or need to move, they seems to be a little bit invisible. Their motivation seems to be like hidden in a sense, because that's like, you know, sea level rise and land degradation is progressive, it's not really immediate. So I was wondering whether any of your organizations have like work on that. And just a brief comment about Professor Herald on the issue of migration as part of the problem, but also a part of the solution. I was thinking that maybe the solution is not like an adequate. I wonder whether it is a proper solution for indigenous communities, because indigenous communities have a more collective relationship with their lands, and their lands really represent or define their identity and their culture and cosmovision. So maybe the impacts of climate change to them and making them move because of climate change impacts may not be like a real solution for them, because they could actually be at risk of disappearance. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have more than 3 questions, basically, and I would maybe ask Manuel to start, and then we go down the panel. Very interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, indeed. Land grabbing, yes. Let me change the conversation a bit on the land grabbing to say I think the biggest risk of issues of land grabbing is the authoritative decisions to move people out of an area that is considered unsafe without the consultation of the community, because it becomes an Excel problem of how much you need to invest for people to be safe and stay, and how much you need to invest to move them somewhere else and not provide all the resources, because you cannot provide all the resources, but then they will solve their own problem, right? These metrics is what's going to be a big challenge for coastal communities and communities that are on semi-arid areas, where, of course, the slow onset processes will end in very acute droughts or heat waves, and those things will be what will move people in terms of the land grabbing, right? And the lack of productivity of cottage agriculture may also trigger land grabbing, because the technology needed to put those parcels of land to be viable will only be possible with investments that do not cope with small, cottage subsistence agriculture. In terms of health, yes, I think that's a big problem. And at least I actually had a meeting with all the health coordinators of IOM across the world last week, and I was telling them the most important thing is the quality of the service that you give and how people can access that service. So if we turn into what the IPCC talks about, the climate resilient development, and we invest in climate resilient infrastructures, we are guaranteeing that the infrastructures and the access to health is there, as long as, of course, the governments have the capacity to strengthen those health systems. But we also need to change the way how we build those buildings so that they are climate comfortable for people that work there, that go there, or that have to stay there. And that is a shift, including on the humanitarians and in many governments, from pre-ordered boxes of concrete that an engineer or an architect does somewhere and costs an X and then is standard by the kilo, right? This will need a much closer approximation of what's the environment around. Is tropical, is semi-arid, does it have wind, can be passive architectures. I think the big challenge for me on health will be about access and about the quality of the service. Because, you know, a woman that enters in labor can be several hours in labor in a building that is a concrete box. Right? And then, of course, the availability of services will also be important for people to use the services. In relation, and very quickly in relation to the Philippines and this issue of the relocation, it will continue to be a right to choose. People should be able to choose, but people need to be conscious of the risks. And there is a division of responsibilities between the state and the individual that will need to be strengthened. It won't work in every country. I can give you an example. I live in a coastal community and I wanted to rebuild my house, and by law, the government of Portugal told me that I cannot have a room on the ground floor of my grandparents' house because there may be the risk on a 100-year flood, 1 meters of flood water in my house. So to license the building, I had to commit never to put a room on the ground floor. If I ever put a room and someone dies in a flood, the government is not responsible. So this division of roles and responsibilities, understanding of risk, and sharing the responsibilities, I think will be very important in the future, especially for coastal communities and other. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you for your question, and very quickly I will react on just complementing Manuel for the Philippines. I think to restore this lack of trust, like this trust that you were mentioning, I think access to information for communities is also essential, and inclusion of communities in all the decision making that affects their life is also essential. So it will be particularly important for plan relocation to make sure that communities are consulted so that they do not perceive this decision as imposed to them, but that they are part of it and that they can express their choice and their preferences and make sure that it's also rights-based processes. And on your question, Mariana, yeah, it's a very good point. And actually, by disasters at IDMC, we understand both sudden onset and slow onset disasters. So it's true that in terms of access to data and availability of data, it's most of the time easier to assess and report on displacement triggered by sudden onset hazards. We still face a lot of data gaps and challenges to effectively report and properly monitor displacement in slow onset processes. But we started to do so for drought-related displacement since a couple of years. We still are not in capacity to assess the level of displacement due to sea level rise or saline intrusion, erosion, those kind of slow onset processes, but it's clearly a gap that needs to be filled.
Thank you. I also learned that I was a little bit optimistic with my extension of the time given the next event, but nevertheless, I think if you would like to come in also, and also Karen online on this, especially also on the last question on this mitigation adaptation policy option, then happy.
Yeah. Just very quick, as I think there was no question directed to me, but I think to bring in the health perspective really, really is important. So in times of crisis, we really need to make sure that sexual and reproductive health services are there, or integrate, for example, social and sexual abuse during heat waves in our research. So there's so much more to investigate. So health really is an under-researched area. Maybe there are some master students in the room here.
Yeah, thank you very much. With regard to time, let me just briefly go to your question. Yes, that was a bit shortened up how I presented that. Like, not all kind of mobility and migration can be a part of solution, right? Involuntary displacement, involuntary relocation, evacuation, and the ability not to come back. These are not part of solution and cannot be. What I meant is that there are parts or types of mobilities that are already parts of people's adaptive practices. Think of pastoralism, for example, that has been cut down in many regions of the world in the past decades due to connotations of non-modernism or attempts to sedentarize mobile groups. Nevertheless, pastoralist groups have tremendous indigenous knowledge of how to deal with climate variabilities. And this, for example, can be a big part of solutions to be found. And then we need also to think about how to, this what I meant with this connectivity thing, to compensation is one part, but also to sustain, maybe if we have these examples where regions also in the Philippines are declared non-habitable zones after Typhoon Haiyan, for example, where people could not return. And even if, as Manuel pointed out, if the state decides that these are high-risk areas, you could still give people the opportunity to have parts of the household being there, being supported by either the government or the international community, if this is a clear-cut case of involuntary, partly out migration, but where the place matters in a degree. where people decide. And I think that would follow what Mary said. It's about choice. I mean, the IPCC very clearly lines that out that under the conditions of free choice, the probability of mobility being part of a solution are higher. If there's no choice, there's almost no option of migration. Mobility can be part of or thought of as a solution.
Yeah, which brings our focus to the trapped population, basically. Karin, I would like to give you the chance for the last word to close more or less this panel, because we are coming to an end. So is there something you would like to come in?
Yes, firstly, I would like to concur with the former speaker who highlighted that there's still a gap in collection of data, especially for slow onset events such as land degradation. And that is why I'd like to stress still the need of like innovative data collection methods that can help us get there or be on our way. And through the project, we mapped out 10-year satellite images and then extracted soil carbon levels, and we had that map set aside and then married in with land productivity levels in the area, and thus helped us to some extent have some concrete information to see, to figure out vulnerabilities, for instance, for farmers on the ground or people practicing agriculture and things of the like. So we're still on our way, and more innovation is needed in that regard. But also when it comes to the issue of governance and trust issues in adaptation projects or planned relocation projects, I think it is very important to diversify the financial and administrative pillars of these adaptation projects, to say bring in more partners in these projects and not just have a certain party overseeing this, maybe a government only or an institution only. The more we have more stakeholders and players on the ground, it diversifies the potential of this project being transparent and more accountable, but also for it to realize the impact that it wants to realize, but also brings in more people in the community to understand it and be part of the project and creating the solutions that we need to see. And lastly, may we please not forget young people. We are at grassroots level and we are creating the solutions to climate mobility challenges, and we are innovators, and we need to be supported and be given the space to showcase the work that we're doing in order to get more impact in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a terrific last word, a closing of today's side event. And I would like to ask my colleagues here in the audience to spend a warm round of applause for the panelists. And thank you. So thank you very much.